Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Movers podcast, the off-topic podcast for Avatar The Last Airbender Online.com. This is going to be episode 45, and this time the show that we're going to be reviewing is the first two episodes of the anime Samurai Champloo, as chosen by Greg. We're recording this on February 19th, 2017. I'm going to be your host for the first section of the podcast, Morgan, Airspeed Prime. Joining me is just one other host today, and that is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, pretty quick show that we're probably going to have this time around. We're just going to quickly go over what we've been playing recently, and then we'll jump straight into Samurai Champloo. So, myself, I haven't been watching too much new stuff. I suppose the only notable thing would be that I started rewatching Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, which is the third Yu-Gi-Oh! Series. Most people probably know it as card games on motorcycles. But I think it's probably still, even like with all going into like the sixth Yu-Gi-Oh! Series coming out in a few months, it's probably the best Yu-Gi-Oh! Series that's actually out there, just because the characters are a bit older and they tried to do more with the plot. And in my opinion, synchros are probably the most interesting kind of like new mechanic that they introduced to kind of change up how the game actually works within the show. So I'm enjoying going through that as kind of a really kind of cool memories from like when I was like, I suppose, most into Yu-Gi-Oh! But Greg, what have you been playing recently?
Not too much recently. I'm still watching Dragon Ball Super, as that has come out and is getting to its main sort of tournament arc that they've been sort of hyping up for a while now. So it's good that they've gotten into that. They're about 2 episodes into that, so that's been fun. And then the only other thing that I've been watching after we reviewed it a while ago, or maybe 1 or 2 movers ago, which was Usagi Drop. I finished that one pretty quickly since it was only 11 episodes, and it was interesting to see how it played out. So I kind of enjoyed just the anime, just seeing how it went, and all the other extra stuff that sort of goes along with it that Kelly didn't really mention. So no, I thought that was a pretty good series, a very nice sort of quick series to enjoy.
And now that she's not here, you can go and read the manga as well.
Yeah. I did read the manga. So it definitely has a different take. I don't know. It was interesting just to see where it goes. I won't do any spoilers or anything for the manga, so people can figure that out on their own if they choose to read it. It's not that long of a manga. It took me probably like a week or so to finish it. Reading it pretty straightforward though. But yeah, no, so that was interesting to see where that took it to as well. But it's still a pretty interesting series overall, regardless of if you choose to go further or not.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we're just going to jump straight into the main topic from here on out, and that is Samurai Champloo. So Greg, I suppose you're going to be taking over from here. Give us an introduction to this show.
Yeah, so Samurai Champloo is a action adventure, comedy, has historical references in there, samurai sort of shonen type show. It came out in around May of 2004, and it ran about 26 episodes. And it actually splits it up into 2 seasons. The first season having 18 episodes, and the second having 8. But when I watched it the first time, it aired all together, so I didn't even really know that there was like a season block, and that's sort of like an odd number, I think, for seasons. Regardless, I watched it on Adult Swim, which was aired in 2005, so probably after the original run is when I first watched it for the first time. And then I've gone back and watched it at least. I think I remember watching it once in subs as well. But the series is developed by Magna Globe. It's sort of it's directed by Shinshiro Watanabe, who also did Cowboy Bebop, which we reviewed before. It has a rating of around 8.5 on MyAnimeList and around 8.6 on IMDb. So the show itself is it's set in sort of the Edo era of Japan, and it sort of has various sort of historical references, as I mentioned before, as well as it has sort of a crossover with sort of a hip hop setting, sort of taken back to similar to Cowboy Bebop with sort of the jazz sort of crossover that it has with that and technology and space. So it's another one of those series that sort of blends the two different things together. Not so much as far as the visual references, although there are a few that you can see later on in the series, but more mainly the music specifically, which is done by a few different sort of artists and producers. It has DJ Chisui, a Japanese hip hop duo called Force of Nature. It also has the DJ producer Nujabes, and it also has American MC producer named Fat John as well. So that's sort of the basic sort of overview of it. So Morgan, what did you sort of your initial sort of thoughts to these sort of first two episodes did you have?
Yeah, I really liked it. I definitely, like, after seeing this, have seen certain clips of this just because I think I subscribe to some people on YouTube who do kind of who would win in fights type situations, and in their kind of interlude switching between segment bits, they kind of show little clips of fight scenes from like Star Wars, and I've definitely seen a few little bits of, especially the main character in action. So it was really cool to see that some of that stuff in context, and I really liked it. The fights were really cool, which I think is definitely like one of the main emphasized bits of the show. But I like what's presented initially about the characters so far, the kind of odd duo who are initially fighting, kind of coming together, and then um, Fu as our kind of main female character, kind of keeping them from fighting and kind of forming the main group. It's definitely a kind of unique trio of characters, and the plot, obviously they don't do a ton with the plot, but they'd set up some stuff like rivalries already between characters. Kind of they're setting up fights for the future, and some kind of more world building stuff going forward, a little bit of mystery. So in general, I thought this had like a little bit of everything, in addition to having kind of a good bit of style with regards to how it did the animation, how everyone had unique fight styles, and as you kind of alluded to, the kind of hip hop styling on like the intro, the kind of weird interlude bits that they do and stuff like that. So it was really interesting to me.
Yeah, no, it definitely is sort of one of those so interesting sort of standout sort of animes. One of the ones that I've always sort of, remembered from when I sort of first watched it. It wasn't sort of like my first sort of anime series at all, but it's one of the ones that really sort of, got me sort of thinking about just sort of the genre in general and just sort of how, how well you can sort of blend different things that, necessarily you wouldn't think sort of, have a reason to sort of go with each other, but you can definitely see how in this sort of setting here, how, even if it is mainly sort of the music sort of cues that sort of come out throughout the show, predominantly during sort of like the fight scenes, you can see sort of how, how it can influence sort of the mood of the show, and even sort of, Mugen sort of his sort of style of action and fighting. You can definitely see how it can be sort of reflected in his sort of, combat, you could say, which is sort of interesting just to see that. And it being one of the more sort of popular sort of anime that people sort of always sort of think about, even if they're not sort of interested in anime in general, they sort of they know about this is one of the anime that has received a lot of sort of Western praise, or just praise in general. The creators of Avatar, they have referenced this before, as far as one of their shows that have sort of influenced them, or just sort of brought them into the genre. I mean, I was doing research for this at work, and one of my other coworkers, he's like, I remember that show, that was pretty good as well. So it's definitely one of those very sort of popular anime that a lot of people can enjoy, even if they're not necessarily totally into animation or anime in general. But with that getting across, let's start into some topics. I guess since we sort of have already been sort of talking about the music, I'll just sort of go with that right in the beginning. What was sort of your thoughts on sort of the blending that they have here of just sort of the hip hop with the sort of Japanese sort of samurai era here? Did it sort of work for you? Did it sort of throw you out of the loop? What were your thoughts on that?
Um, I suppose it took like me a couple of minutes within the first episode to get used to the fact that I was just kind of like, wait, is this kind of like jet set radio kind of stuff going on here at the start with with the
Yeah.
kind of graffiti things of just like, this is not historically accurate, and like just sit down and enjoy the show, like little things coming up that like it's trying to have attitude, but then when you jump into the world, it's kind of pretty straight to the point, like samurais, kind of Ronin type stuff, which was it ended up working out quite well. It's just an extra element of style on it, and as you said, with the idea of like Mugen's fight style kind of being like samurai mixed with kind of like a hip hop breakdancer type thing, it actually ends up working out quite interestingly, because the show also has a unique sense of kind of humor, in addition to the fact that it's also kind of quite dark and violent at times, that there are kind of interesting humorous stuff going on as well. So I enjoyed the music, and I'm interested to see how they kind of use it more as we get into more of the, I suppose, bigger fights and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting sort of element, and if you're not really sort of expecting it, it's definitely not something that you would necessarily think would sort of, go with it per se. You would think, more sort of, I guess sort of like classical or traditional sort of Japanese music, especially with it being set in sort of the samurai sort of era there. It's not necessarily something you would think they would sort of cross, breed with sort of, the more sort of urban sort of hip hop sort of aspect of things, but it definitely, it's definitely sort of a very sort of stylized thing. It definitely is very, very sort of unique. There are a couple other shows that I can think of that, put a lot of sort of emphasis on sort of music, but not so many as much that do it with sort of hip hop per se. There's a couple there's like even like, there'll be like certain characters that'll be like more sort of rap based. Like I can think of a character from Naruto who was always, spitting sort of random rhymes that doesn't necessarily make any sense, but that was sort of like a one-off sort of character thing. Versus here, it's more sort of integrated into just the whole sort of flow of things. So I think, for me, it definitely sort of worked growing up with listening to hip hop and stuff. It definitely sort of, was something that I really personally sort of appreciated, just sort of having those sort of musical elements in there as well.
Yeah,
But yeah,
it did remind me a little bit of Naruto in a way, in that like at least in the first part of the series, like Naruto's music is basically like traditional Japanese music mixed with rock, and here it's kind of
yeah.
traditional Japanese kind of mixed with hip hop. So that's, I think, a good comparison as well. I think a lot of people like Naruto's music because of that kind of unique kind of electric guitar kind of rock element to it, and this is a
Yeah.
different take on it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was definitely a cool part of Naruto, and I think it definitely, it's just something different that adds an extra element to it. I think it's, it gives us something, and especially I guess for, if it does, go across the seas, especially for Western audiences, it gives us, personally something to sort of cue into that we're already sort of somewhat familiar with. So definitely, it's something that can, attack sort of a broader range of sort of audiences, which I think is pretty cool that it can go that far. But I guess we're switched to you if you have a talking point that you want to go with.
Yeah, I suppose I'll probably, where we're talking about the kind of different aspects of the show, I'll go for the animation this time out. I really enjoyed the animation, obviously with a fighting focused show like this, but one where they're not necessarily going for like characters having like set attacks and like saying the names of attacks and stuff like that. You do have to emphasize like the fluidity of fight scenes and like get a style of each character across. I thought that was kind of demonstrated really well, and I think in a way that's probably the way like the show is presented. If you look in the description of like of what the show is, it's like the wild Mugen, and then like the disciplined Jean is the kind of
Yeah.
kind of basic idea of what the show's about, and at them animating the way they fight very differently, as you see in one of the first fight scenes, definitely highlights that, oh, they're really going for these fight scenes in terms of showing differences in style and highlighting how different each character is. But even in the kind of the scenes where they're not fighting, it's also unique, in that you get a lot of unique kind of like physical comedy with like Fu being kind of clumsy doing stuff, and her coming up with plans in the background and that sort of thing. So I like the animation a lot. It gets good expressions across, as well as being really good in the fight scenes and action.
Yeah, no, I think the animation for this show is definitely really good, and considering it did come out in 2004, 2005, it's pretty interesting to see, how it's sort of held up. It's definitely, it's not sort of the highest quality. It's not like HD or anything like that, since that wasn't really, around back then. But it definitely, has clean lines. The animation is very sort of fluid, especially in sort of the action scenes. You can definitely see sort of, why people would sort of reference this show as far as, a good, just overall, just good sort of animation and just good sort of flow of action, and just how they set up the scenes, how they set up sort of the action. I think is done really well in this, and overall I think it just has a a really sort of good look to it in general, which sort of brings me to my next topic, which is just sort of, just how did you feel about the setting of the show in general? Just, it being in sort of, the Edo period of Japan with sort of samurais and just sort of that whole sort of, I guess, period of time. I guess that's around like the 1600s. Just sort of how did that sort of feel for you in general? Just sort of, getting used to this world in general with, samurais and lords and just sort of how, the system, I guess, is set up or how the ruling system is set up.
Yeah, like I like the setting. I think I said it like roughly when we did like Moribito, which I wouldn't say it's set in the exact same time period, but it's in or around that. You don't see a ton of anime, surprisingly enough, that's just kind of set in this kind of period, which is kind of, I suppose, the very kind of romanticized era of kind of like Japan in terms of like action type shows and stories.
Hmm.
So I actually like appreciated that they just went for that. It was just characters with swords, and given, like as I said earlier on, the whole this is not historically accurate thing that they're going for. You can tell that the animators, the writers of the show, are just like, yeah, we just want to do cool fights with swords and this sort of thing, and we'll try and our best to be historically accurate around that, which I'm not too familiar with this type of Japanese history. It seemed to fit to me. I wasn't like taken out by anything feeling weird within the world or anything like that, but I definitely like this kind of simplistic kind of approach where it's just like, okay, characters are going to have swords, bladed weapons, and we're a long way away from just crazy technology being introduced and that sort of thing. I like the simplicity of knowing that if there's a fight, it's going to be like a melee fight, and I assume at some point we may see archers, that sort of thing. And we see, like, I suppose with food, the whole idea of like smoke bombs and stuff like that as well, fireworks as kind of makeshift weapons. So I like this setting, definitely. It's kind of like the whole Avatar going into Korra thing. Most people are kind of like, oh, if they do more, I want them to kind of go back in time rather than forward, because technology takes away a little bit from the martial arts focus. And I definitely like where this is set.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely, the setting itself, it works pretty well. I mean, the whole sort of, idea of just sort of the melee battles and just sort of the close sort of combat, I think, it's definitely something that, this era of Japan or just, in the world in general, is something that, is more focused on before we get, sort of like, guns and blasters and all that stuff here. And we do see sort of the fireworks, which, it's predominantly always been sort of in sort of Asian cultures in general, just the whole idea of the use of sort of gunpowder in general. So, there definitely will be sort of some of that, but you'll still, at the core of it, you'll still have, sort of the one-on-one sort of battles or the action scenes with characters. And even if they have, rather sort of, unique sort of abilities or skills in general, it'll still, for the most part, revolve around that sort of, close quarter combats with our sort of main characters here. So I think it's definitely something that's pretty cool. And just the whole idea of it being set in this period, I think is cool. And yeah, they make the point in the beginning that it's not sort of historically sort of accurate, but they definitely put a lot of effort into making it feel like it's part of that sort of era of the world. And even if you don't know much about it, like you said, it all sort of feels cohesive and together. There actually are a couple bits throughout the series where they actually do reference directly things that actually sort of happened historically during that time. So despite them sort of saying that, they do actually throw some things in there. Not that you're gonna like learn a ton of things about Japanese sort of culture and history just from this sort of show. There are other sort of shows that would do that a lot better than this one, since it is more action based. But they definitely do for the parts that they do try to make that effort, and they do a good job of it. So yeah, no, I think it's definitely something that's really cool of the show. But I think we're back to you if you got another point.
I suppose speaking a little bit about the kind of tone of the show, I was definitely kind of interested with just how like surprisingly violent it was. That like I'm used to watching a lot of anime where just like characters have swords and they're really amazing swordsmen, but you rarely, if ever, see them like actually like really hurt someone with a sword. Like even Bleach, which is basically all about sword fighting, you see them get cut, but it's more of just like slashes on their chests and stuff like that. Like, but here, like one of the first attacks that actually hits is like Mugen chopping a guy's arm off, and then in like little backstory bits with other characters, you see like the ground like littered with pieces of bodies, and just them constantly talking about people being killed on the streets just because like you walked the wrong way or didn't have enough money. There's definitely a kind of dark tone to this show, even if there's a lot of fun based around some aspects of it. And then yeah, just like people are getting killed in like almost every single fight scene. That was kind of surprising to me, but maybe that just speaks more to the which animes I watch and the ones that I don't watch. But it was interesting to me to see that.
Yeah, it definitely is something of this show, and I don't know if it's sort of a product of his sort of era or something like that, but it definitely is, this is a mature show. It's definitely not something that I would recommend to sort of like little kids to watch, even though I'm pretty sure I was pretty young when I watched it. Maybe not too young. That's probably around sort of middle school when I watched it the first time, so it's not really that young, or maybe it is too young. I don't know. But yeah, it definitely is sort of a mature show. They definitely show all the hits, all of the bleeding, all of the sort of cuts in the limbs and stuff, and the bodies. I mean, they don't. It's usually not sort of too grotesque. Usually, when they do show it, they usually have a reason for showing it. Like I could think of, I don't know if it's in the second episode or maybe it's the episode after the second one, where they definitely do sort of like cut away before you see like the big, really big sort of cut slash scene or whatever. So they don't always try to put it straight in your face, whereas some other shows, they would just be sort of like all over the place, just blood shooting out all over the place. But you do still get a bit of that, so it does definitely have some realism to it, which with swords, that is something that you would see. It's not like there wouldn't be any blood when you're fighting with swords, even though a lot of more modern shows, they definitely sort of tone down on that sort of thing. So it definitely is something to sort of keep in mind, I guess, if you're a little squeamish on sort of seeing a lot of blood and stuff. But yeah, that is something to sort of keep in mind.
Yeah, it's the whole like problem I suppose in Avatar with Sokka. He's a swordsman. We're never ever gonna see him actually like really injure someone with a sword. He obviously doesn't have it at this point in the comics, but like if he ever gets it back, like, and he has a fight, like we're still not really probably gonna see him like actually like hurt anyone with it. Like it was the same with most of the fights. None of the swordsmen ever really like did anything, and it's just like in Avatar you sort of knew that like the bending attacks always had to do this or that to kind of get around it, or the worst one like Jet being killed, they had to like cut away. They didn't really show the impact. So with this show, it was just interesting to see like he grabs the guy's knife and just stabs him, and little moments like that they make it clear that no, they are absolutely hurting people with these swords, and they needed to, I think, do that to get across the kind of tone of the world and what they're going for, with the whole idea of like the people who have power kind of abusing it over the people who don't, and that you have to kind of fight to kind of get your way up. So it definitely fit the overall kind of tone of the show.
Yeah, and I think going along with that, we'll just continue with that thread of thought there. What did you sort of think specifically of, sort of our action scenes here? We have, Jin and Mugen sort of, fighting each other right off the bat in the beginning, as well as, trying to start fights throughout sort of the whole sort of 2 episodes here. And then we also have sort of Jin versus the assassin, which I don't think we ever get a name for him, and Mugen sort of versus the monster, Oniwakumaru, and as well as I guess the other sort of prefix sort of bodyguard, as well as various other sort of little sort of scuffles throughout the whole sort of series. What were your sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, like they were all very unique. I think the one that stands out the most is definitely the little back and forth that Mugen and Jean have at the near the start. That definitely got across their styles very well. Just the fact that Mugen was like jumping off the walls and stuff like that, was like approaching him from really different angles, and you can sort of tell that Jin was like this expert, just like technical swordsman. But especially in the second episode, I think with the assassin in that fight, they tried to very clearly show that Jin is like a very good technical swordsman, but he maybe doesn't adapt to like his surroundings. He doesn't. He maybe isn't the best at adapting to people who have unique styles, and so to some degree, I suppose pairing Mugen and Jin up as a kind of duo in a way, but rivals, they may end up kind of learning from each other, and like Mugen becoming more technical, Jin becoming more unorthodox, and just this idea that their fight styles are a style. It's not just that they have a few moves that they use every time, and then they just did different stuff with the fact that like in the second episode you had like a huge guy who just had like monstrous strength, and if he touched you basically you were dead, but he was kind of slow, and you had some action stuff there with like Mugen being poisoned and he was at a disadvantage. And then the Jin versus the assassin bit reminded me a lot of Piandao versus Sokka in a way, kind of in that like I was kind of like, did they just like take just the setting of it kind of being in like a bamboo forest and like the basic idea of using the terrain to your advantage a bit is that where this is coming from? But all of the fights I think were unique, and it's definitely like the thing where like I want to watch more just to see how they do more unique fights going forward, and who the enemies are, how they do it, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, it definitely seems like various sort of fights could have been sort of referenced from other places, although I think those are just, pretty sort of popular sort of concepts in general, how they have the sort of fight scenes sort of laid out here. But yeah, I think it's definitely really cool. It's definitely one of the highlights of the show in general, just sort of how they do the fights here and just sort of how they display the sort of various sort of fighting styles and how different characters sort of, use their sort of combat abilities against one another, and just sort of, how you can see the distinction within sort of the styles. I think is definitely something that they put a lot of sort of effort into, just sort of seeing sort of how the battles work, how the weapons. Even, I mean, we don't really see any too sort of crazy sort of weapons here, but there are some times where they do have, more sort of unique sort of weapons that sort of, change the whole dynamic of the battle in general, especially if they're sort of more sort of range weapons. I think it's interesting to see sort of how that sort of works out. And, like you mentioned with Oniwaka, who has like sort of the monstrous sort of strength here, there definitely sort of are sort of, outliers as far as characters with different abilities that you sort of, don't expect in general. So yeah, no, I think it's definitely one of the highlights of the show in general. I mean, besides, just sort of the story overall and the plot that they sort of, hint at in the beginning of these episodes, I think it's definitely something that, anyone sort of can enjoy in general while they're sort of watching this show to the end. But we're back to you if you got another point.
Yeah, I suppose this one is kind of just talking about the whole idea of the people who have kind of power, kind of abusing it. I think a lot of these first two episodes revolves around the governor and people related to the governor, and how Mugen ends up annoying those people, and because Dean is a Ronin, he also kind of ends up annoying them as well. And just the little things like that. There are people in this world who like Fu makes a mistake, and like they're about to like cut her fingers off just because she makes a mistake. And just the fact that you have these sort of things continuing on, that like these people who feel they have such a high position that if anyone ever wrongs them, like they kind of devote themselves to trying to take them out. And like you get the kind of one-armed guy in the second episode kind of coming after Mugen, and it was just interesting to kind of see that like they don't go crazy in depth in these first two episodes, or maybe I missed some lines of dialogue, but just that I think they're subtly setting stuff up in the background here about like the kind of power structure here, and kind of who the real enemy is, sort of thing, which may relate to like Fu's story exactly. But I like that to a degree, that we have our kind of rogue characters kind of going against the kind of established kind of government in a way.
Yeah, no, our characters, they definitely, they definitely don't see eye to eye on sort of the current sort of status quo that, the world seemed to sort of present to them, which is, interesting considering, Jin specifically being sort of, the more sort of technical sort of, warrior. You'd think that, he would sort of, get the idea more so of sort of devoting yourself to one person, but no, he sort of questions this just as much as Mugen does. So it's definitely something that they sort of set up, just a whole sort of, just this era in general, this era, which I guess you get to it more in like a couple episodes later, but you get the sense of just the whole era of sort of the times are changing, how the way the world is sort of works and sort of is organized is sort of changing from sort of the past sort of, I guess more sort of, sort of brutal way of sort of, conflicting things towards the more sort of, organized, maybe maybe more peaceful sort of setting of things. And our main sort of two characters here definitely are sort of are caught in the middle of this whole sort of transition here. And even though they're pretty young, they're 20 and 19, they definitely seem like ones from sort of a bygone sort of era here. So it's definitely interesting to see how they sort of clash with sort of the status quo and just sort of how everything is, supposed to work and how how it's turning out to actually work. So it's definitely something to sort of keep in mind. It's not, such a sort of huge thing. There is more of the main sort of, plot sort of heavy things that come later on, but it definitely is something that, comes up later on just because, they're, as they say, they're vagabonds. They're definitely, they're not part of the established sort of society here. They're, Ronin sort of warriors here. So it's definitely something that the show sort of, makes note of here and there. But I think we're back to me here. So I guess for my next sort of point here is just sort of, what did you think overall of just sort of the sort of more mature sort of themes here? We have sort of, almost sort of a sex scene in here, and just sort of, the whole idea of just being sort of a more sort of mature type of show.
Yeah, that was interesting to see certain scenes like that, just to see what the guys in the kind of the tea place were kind of doing, and just the overall kind of uncomfortable setting of like because like Fu very much comes across immediately as kind of like our main female character, just kind of worried like, oh, what's she working here for? And like anytime someone comes near her, you're kind of like afraid for her. But then you see like later on that like, okay, Mugen considers himself somewhat of a ladies' man, and like he kind of gets trapped by that girl who's there just to kind of poison him. It was interesting to see a show kind of just be a little bit more kind of open about stuff like that, like kind of showing kind of more kind of sexual elements to a degree in the show, because I think especially in anime they tend to, at least the ones I've seen, only ever like tease romances and stuff like that, and then like they never ever really address the whole any sort of sexual element at all. So it was interesting to even see the show like approach that in a way, but it makes it kind of feel more realistic in that we're in an era where like people who have power feel they can kind of do anything that sort of way.
Yeah, no, the show definitely sort of takes a more sort of mature approach to that in general, which is interesting just to see it sort of, try to sort of approach those things. It's definitely something of this period of time in sort of Japanese sort of culture here, where that sort of thing was more prevalent. Like it wasn't, it wasn't so uncommon to actually see more of those sort of topics sort of, discussed in the open, even sort of like the scene with Jin and the assassin, and they're sort of in the bathing area together. Like they do, occasionally bring up themes of homosexuality and just sort of other ideas in general. I mean, this, era in general, they have, brothels and sort of stuff like that. So it's definitely something that, the show tries to show some tact with approaching it, as well as, it's never just sort of, I guess, for fan service sort of, sort of approach. I mean, they had that little bit with Fu, with the bombs, but other than that, they definitely, don't just do those things just sort of to do them. Usually they have a point to either the plot in general, or at least towards the story or the sort of mini arc that they're sort of going for in the episodes itself. So it's never sort of, out of place. It fits with the era, which, may make you sort of uncomfortable, but it sort of works with what the show's sort of going for. So I don't know. I think it's something interesting that they decided to do in this show. And, with anime in general being, generally you would think of it being more geared towards kids. This is definitely one of those elements that, you would need to be sort of a bit older to sort of understand and sort of to appreciate. So I think it's definitely something that sort of, the show, keeps in mind in general. But I think we're back to you for a point.
Yeah, I suppose before we get into characters, I suppose the plot as is kind of presented in the first two episodes, the main thing seems to just be the kind of formation of this kind of team of three, Mugen, Jin, and Fu, coming together primarily with the idea that the two of them are acting as her bodyguards, as she wants to search for this samurai who smells like sunflowers, and just the fact that she knows this but doesn't seem to, or maybe she just didn't have a chance to answer, but maybe potentially doesn't have all the information about this person she's looking for. And it's just interesting that like kind of her plot, even though kind of Mugen and Jin are sort of presented and feel like the main characters. Most of the plot seems to be more driven by Fu right now, which I think is interesting. So, like especially with Mugen, who very much in like all descriptions and stuff like that seems to be the main character. He kind of right now seems like the one with potentially like the least direction, in that like he just kind of turns up at the start of the episode and ends up sticking around because of promises and stuff like that. Jin, they sort of present some things a little bit, just with the fact that like he's a Ronin, so there's clearly a backstory there. I think the only thing with Mugen was that people had like a shocked reaction where he like when he mentioned wherever he was from. But I wasn't really sure what to make of that right now, which I suppose is part of the mystery. But yeah, I suppose just the main thing with the plot being that like Fu is our kind of main plot driver right now at the moment. The other two are kind of almost just there for the action at the moment.
Yeah, no, I mean it definitely they do present, the whole idea of the samurai that smells of sunflower and just sort of, Fu has some interest in sort of finding her, which, as the story goes on, you do find that they don't leave you sort of hanging on that sort of plot line. As well as sort of our other characters, we do sort of get, sort of their sort of stories as well. And I think it's interesting just sort of, how they do sort of the sort of formation of our group here. I think is interesting, just sort of, how they sort of, they're captured and, Fu, wants to use them as bodyguards to sort of, meet this sort of samurai, which, Mugen himself, he doesn't even like understand what a sunflower is or what it sort of smells of. So, they have that whole sort of funny bit with that. But yeah, it definitely does sort of revolve. I mean, obviously, it's these three characters are our main sort of driving force in the series, regardless. And this show definitely, takes us on a journey towards finding, what Fu is sort of looking for in this sort of, all the sort of like, I guess, sort of twists and turns, or just, different ways they go about and sort of their adventures along the way. There's nothing sort of, too sort of heavy that you sort of have to like, sort of think, maybe sort of super deep about, but they definitely sort of, weave it together in sort of like a interesting sort of way that sort of, makes it, worth, the ride of actually sort of, following these characters along on their sort of journey here. So, it's definitely something that's, pretty cool that the show actually sort of tries to do for sure. But I guess sort of continuing with, sort of the plots around the characters, I guess we'll just sort of get into our characters here. And I guess, which character do you want to sort of start off with?
Well, I personally can't really remember the names of most of the characters outside of the other three, so I suppose you should maybe kind of guide us through some of the more, kind of more minor.
It's really just the main three characters. I mean, there's in these first two episodes, there's no sort of, I guess, sort of recurring sort of characters. So it really is just sort of Mugen, Jin, and Fu, who we really sort of need to discuss with. I guess unless you want to talk about in sort of Momo, the sort of flying squirrel that we see too.
Yeah, I actually forgot that. Yeah, they ended up killing off most of the villains who almost came across like they were going to be hunting them for multiple episodes. But yeah, they kind of killed them both in the second episode. So yeah, I suppose we'll start off with I suppose Fu. I think is actually really interesting as our kind of main female character in that. Yeah, like as I said, like she kind of has the most kind of plot going on right now, and just this idea of like she kind of has this mystery. They mention that she doesn't have a family, and when the tea place burns down, she kind of realizes that, oh, I've actually decided what I want to do now. And clearly what she's decided is that these two, based on the little she's seen of them, are in her mind kind of like honorable enough to be bodyguards and kind of travel with, to finally have people to investigate this with. And I think that's interesting, just the way that she instantly kind of finds them trustworthy, despite the fact that they're kind of both like out to fight people and like almost kill them all the time. But that, I suppose, to a degree, the idea of Mugen being like familiar enough to kind of be able to make those kind of deals for like 50 100 dumplings if I help you with this situation. And then I think she can definitely sense that Jin is actually like a kind of a truly honorable person who does actually care, whereas everyone else comes across like they basically don't have any honor. And she feels she can trust them and kind of goes out of her way to kind of help them escape with the kind of crazy plan that she ends up coming up with to distract everyone. It's an interesting character. Like she's she definitely is kind of presented as kind of clumsy to a degree. Uh, and you can sort of see the dynamic that she has these two skilled people, and then she's the kind of klutz of the group a little bit. So that'll be fun to see if like she ever develops like fighting skills of her own, or if she's always going to be this kind of support character in the background. But I definitely liked what was presented of her kind of so far. She's kind of the kind of fun aspect of the group, whereas the other two seem relatively serious a large majority of the time.
Yeah, no, she definitely is sort of the fun sort of, sort of one of the group being sort of the only female there and just sort of, the one that sort of definitely sort of holds them together as you see in these first two episodes here. Like she stops them from fighting a couple of times here, and the whole reason why they sort of, join up with her in the first place is because she sort of flips the coin and, it lands on the right side so that they don't have to sort of fight each other as they try to get away from the people that are sort of trying to capture them. So, she definitely adds, a nice sort of dynamic to the group rather than just having, two dudes who are always sort of trying to fight out with each other. Like she definitely, has, a decent head on her shoulders despite, being clumsy at times. But, I think it's interesting just to see, their dynamic and just seeing how they how they attempt to sort of work together as a group here. And, like you even have the scene where they're trying to sort of, figure out how to sort of get food, and they sort of, try to show everything that they have. And, she's disappointed at, the little bit that they have here. And of course she winds up losing the food. So, they definitely sort of play around with her sort of character and her sort of aspects here. So I think she's, she's definitely an interesting character, and sort of is fun to sort of follow around as they sort of go on their journey here. But I guess switching to the next character we have here, we also have sort of Jin here, who is our sort of Ronin, warrior who's has as well as Mugen is sort of very skilled in his sort of swordsmanship.
Yeah, he's interesting because obviously he's the more kind of orthodox fighter of the group. He seems to be the kind of very honorable person in that, like, when we're first introduced to him, he's not going to kind of let the governor kind of abuse his power to like kill this man right in front of him and in front of everyone. That like he has that sense of honor, that like I suppose to some degree like doing the right thing. And I suppose the questions you kind of have about him is just kind of like if like he's a kind of samurai Ronin, like why is he on his own, like who trained him and that sort of thing. Like that's the sort of like backstory you're kind of thinking about with him, because if he seems more like a standard character, like why isn't kind of he on the like opposing side? Like why isn't he one of those samurai like guarding someone like this? What's put him into this position where like he's considered like such a rogue kind of character in a way? And very much they seem to be, I suppose, with the assassin, as they kind of make the kind of plot of the second episode, highlight the fact that he's maybe too orthodox with his fighting style and may need to adapt to not always having fights right out in the open, completely flat ground, and that there may be some surrounding stuff that he needs to deal with. So there could be some fun development with him just in terms of his fighting style, and there's the potential for some stuff with his backstory based on kind of the way I'm seeing it right now.
Yeah, no, he definitely has a good bit to his sort of character overall, which I think makes him very sort of interesting. Just the whole aspect of him being, like you said, a very sort of orthodox sort of technical sort of fighter. It definitely sort of makes you sort of wonder sort of where he was trained, sort of how he sort of developed the skills that he has. Sort of why is he a Ronin? I mean that's he could very easily be working with some other sort of lord or for someone in sort of the government. And with his sort of skills, you think that someone would have sort of noticed that sort of early on. So it's definitely it's interesting when you do sort of get his sort of backstory and you get to learn a bit more about his character and just sort of overall him in general. I think it's interesting, just the fact that he has the glasses on his face, which is something that is sort of not very sort of common in this sort of era and time. So he's definitely sort of a interesting sort of one of those sort of quiet characters that you just sort of wonder about, versus sort of Mugen, who's sort of our sort of sort of like crazy sort of wild man sort of type of character who's sort of sort of all over the place, and you don't really know sort of what he's sort of going to say. What did you sort of think of him?
Yeah, like Jin is like the super disciplined one, and then Mugen doesn't seem to have like any discipline whatsoever. He's just kind of all over the place. And just the fact that he comes in, just asked for water, kind of reveals he doesn't have any money, but immediately is just kind of like, oh, you're having trouble with these people. I'll make this deal with you where I'll take them out if you give me this much food. And he kind of seems to have this kind of easy way with people, but probably too easy for a lot of other people. But like Fu kind of seems to kind of like that to a degree, and yeah, just to see how kind of really kind of like all over the place his fighting style is. It's just kind of really unique. Like he's blocking stuff with his kind of sandals, the wooden bits in the sandals, jumping all over the place. Whereas like everyone else that fights basically seems super grounded whenever they fight, and I like that immediately they kind of present the rivalry with him and Jin, and that Jin kind of insults Mugen for having such a like crazy fighting style that like it's just so odd, but he couldn't beat him in the battle, and that kind of I suppose is part of their rivalry, in that Jin kind of wants to prove to him that like the right way to fight is the kind of traditional way, whereas Mugen's actually being so crazy is kind of what keeps him in that fight. I don't think we've got presented too much about like what his kind of actual like serious aspect of his character is. He kind of just seems to want to fight everyone. So it's kind of interesting that the main character is the one who kind of actually has the kind of least kind of really notable things about him beyond just being wild and crazy. So interesting, but I want to kind of find out a little bit more about him to see what kind of what he kind of is trying to do. Like, why is he kind of like the focus of the show in a way? I still kind of want to know what that's about.
Yeah, no, the his character is definitely sort of very odd and sort of unique in that way of him just sort of, being sort of out there, almost sort of not caring about anything, but for some reason he holds this promise that he has with Fu and sort of, high regard as far as, him sort of not breaking it, despite, him and Jin sort of, almost coming to blows a couple of times in these two episodes and later on as well. It's interesting just to see him sort of, I guess sort of develop to a degree later on as sort of the series continues, as well as just sort of his fight style in general, which is very unique in itself, and just sort of like you mentioned how he uses like the metal bits that he has in his sort of custom sandals, those sort of black blades, and how he's able to sort of acrobatically sort of leap sort of all over the place, which is like we've been saying before, is such in contrast to sort of Jin and his fight style in general. I think is definitely something that I think, even if it just makes people sort of drawn to his character in general, which sort of makes you think that he's sort of more the predominant character versus sort of Jin or Fu, despite them for the most part having sort of equal play as far as the trio's concerned, as far as them always sort of being together, despite I guess maybe a couple times when they do sort of split off and then come back together here or there, but I can't remember that sort of happening too much per se. But it's definitely something, and he's definitely sort of just a cool character in general. I think he's just he's unique enough that it makes you just sort of key in on him versus any of the other sort of characters here. But with that being sort of our main sort of characters here, if you got any sort of, I guess, sort of questions or sort of last points that you have before we sort of wrap it up.
Yeah, I suppose the only kind of real kind of question I have is just that, like, obviously with our trio, it seems that Mugen and Jin are going to do most of the fighting, but does like Fu ever learn to fight, or is she kind of in terms of action stuff, does she always stick to kind of being the support kind of role like we saw in these first two episodes?
For the most part, she's generally in sort of the support roles. I mean, I can think of a couple of times, and you do see and hear how she, she's not afraid to get sort of physical. But she doesn't get to like sort of the level of Jin or Mugen as far as having the ability to sort of fight all over the place with any sort of foe or anything. It's not one of the series where you definitely sort of see her sort of like train up or anything like that. It's
Mm.
more about she definitely stays in more support role, and it's more just about her sort of her role in sort of interacting with these characters, which I think is probably the more interesting sort of bit as far as the trio and how they sort of resolve sort of conflicts and things like that. I think is how they sort of play her character for the most part, since she is sort of the reason for them being together in the first place.
Mm. Yep. So as
But yeah,
well,
so I guess with that, yeah. So what are your thoughts overall on the show?
yeah, I definitely really liked it. I definitely am at some point going to watch more of it. If not just to see the other kind of fight scenes. I think the plot has actually done enough that I'm like interested. Just that mystery of like kind of who is this person that kind of Fu wants to find and investigate, and then like are they going to delve into the pasts of Mugen and Jin? So there's definitely stuff within the story that I'm interested in. Plus, I'm just interested to see more fights as they kind of happen as well. And in that sense, it kind of ticked all the boxes kind of for what I kind of went into the show like expecting, and then it kind of has all of them now that I've seen some of it. So I'm definitely going to watch more. I definitely recommend other Avatar fans check it out. And that like to me like the fights here kind of feel kind of like if you like going on like video websites and like watching Avatar fights back, this kind of seems like it has similar fights in terms of like quality and how like unique they are. And if you like the sword fight stuff from Avatar, you'll probably like the most of what this show has to offer as well. So I'm definitely going to watch more. I liked what I saw, but what are your kind of final thoughts on this show that you chose?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely, being one of my personal favorites, recommend it for other people in general to watch. I think, the fight scenes are definitely very good. They definitely, put a lot of effort into them. They don't, they seem like they're well sort of choreographed. I don't know if they went through as much as, as far as Avatar, as far as, referencing sort of real sort of martial artists, but all the fight scenes feel real. They feel sort of cohesive. Different characters have sort of different abilities, so they're not all sort of, stock sort of like, sort of bad guys that they can dispatch in like almost sort of one blow. There are other characters, as we've seen in like the second episode here with Jin and the assassin, that are sort of on par with our characters and definitely give them sort of a hard time, or almost kill them as well. So it's definitely an interesting show in general, and it does have a interesting sort of just journey that they sort of take these characters on in the end, as far as figuring out sort of what food's sort of looking for. So I know I definitely recommend it for sort of Avatar fans in general, just people in general who are looking for sort of a good sort of action anime that is it's a bit older, but it doesn't feel sort of as old as it probably is.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's pretty much the end of the discussion. So for the next Movers podcast, we are doing a listener suggestion show. So we've basically decided that for next time out, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be discussing 2 or 3 episodes of Hey Arnold, depending on how many of the hosts are actually end up being on the show when we get around to doing it. So this was chosen. Hey Arnold was chosen by a listener, and when it was brought up on someone's list during the top 10 animated show list that we did, I think we all kind of talked about it for a little bit and found it somewhat interesting, all had some familiarity with it. So we're kind of taking a slightly different approach to doing this one, in that like it's obviously not really a plot focused show necessarily, so we're kind of just each going to choose a separate episode regardless of kind of where it comes in the series, and just to kind of represent some of the most kind of unique episodes of kind of what Hey Arnold actually is. So, Greg, how excited are you to do that one next time?
That should be pretty cool. I mean, I remember watching sort of all of Hey Arnold. I haven't watched it in quite a while, but I can remember some good episodes, or at least some good times throughout the whole sort of series. So it should be pretty cool to watch Hey Arnold again and see what we sort of think about it.
Yeah, like I remember seeing it a lot when I was younger. I haven't seen it in a while, same as you. But I definitely remember there was a lot of really weird episodes of that show. But it was good and unique and interesting. So I'm excited to get around to doing that next time out. But yeah, that's the Movers Podcast, episode 45 for Samurai Champloo. And yeah, it's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening to this podcast, and bye.
Bye bye.